So my goal today is to humanize the retrofit process by just bringing the focus to the people who are inside the buildings. So I'm going to be talking about engaging residents for deep retrofit success. So I'm going to start with just a bit of information on buildings and our health. Then I'm going to outline the Reframed initiative and talk a little bit about its role in resident engagement. And then finally, I'm going to finish up with best practices for the resident experience. So for those who are familiar, the Pembina Institute is a national clean energy think tank with offices across Canada. We work in many areas, including renewable energy, oil and gas policy, climate policy, and energy efficiency, including in buildings, which is, of course, what I'm here to talk about today. So climate change is impacted quite a bit by buildings, and in some cities, up to 65% of the emissions are coming from these buildings. And knowing that 2/3 of our buildings will still be in operation by 2050, it's clear that by retrofitting buildings, it's a step we need to take to decarbonize Canada. Now, that's less than 30 years, which isn't a lot of time. And we estimate that that means that 600,000 homes need to be retrofitted every year and 32 million square meters of commercial space, which is probably why you guys are all here today. So we also know that climate change is impacting buildings. With all of the recent news on floods and fires, extreme temperatures, and poor indoor air quality, we're seeing this constantly. And we're seeing that it's causing rise in insurance premiums. Cost of fixing all these buildings is getting very large, and it's also causing some lives to be lost. Last year in BC alone, we had a heat dome in June, and we had over 500 people die in their homes just from overheating. Not to mention, we spend up to 90% of our time indoors, and our indoor air quality can have higher levels of pollution than outdoor air, and it can lead to sick building syndrome, respiratory diseases and allergies, the transmission of infectious diseases like COVID-19, and it's especially risky for vulnerable populations. The deep retrofits traditionally focus on achieving deep energy efficiency. However, we think deep retrofits need to include more than that. Given that many of our buildings are at a point of needing major repairs, we see this as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to take measures against the collection of threats that I just mentioned. So now is the time to make our homes more energy efficient and comfortable to live in, pollute less carbon to help fight against climate change, healthier and safer by filtering out pathogens and pollution, more resilient to shocks like floods and power outages, ready for increasing extreme weather that can cause overheating, and to integrate on-site renewable energy to keep the utility bills low. And we somehow have to achieve all of this while keeping housing affordable. And this is a challenge that we still face. Our buildings are our safe havens. Deep retrofits are needed to help shelter from the impacts of climate change and other threats. Sorry, I went too far. There we go. This is why we were inspired by Energy Sprong, which literally means energy leap. So the Dutch are revolutionizing the retrofit process by applying modern production methods to an industry that is as old as civilization. So their solutions include prefabricated exterior wall and roof panels, high efficiency and low carbon mechanical systems, system controls and performance monitoring, and on-site renewable energy. Now, getting here took many years, but these solutions are now being produced in automated manufacturing plants. And this also took a coordinated effort by industry, housing, government, finance, and everyone within the ecosystem. So Energy Sprong is now being syndicated throughout Europe, and versions of it are now emerging in North America, including as the Pembina Institute's own Reframed initiative. So through Reframed, Pembina is fostering innovative tech solutions and broad ecosystem transformation, ultimately to scale up retrofits to make them the standard of our existing buildings to meet. The Reframed initiative is a partnership between the Pembina Institute, BC Nonprofit Housing Association, Metro Vancouver Housing, City of Vancouver, and to carry out deep demonstration projects through the Reframed Lab, we are in partnership with BC Housing. Just want to take a quick second here just to thank our funding partners, including Fortis BC, who is both a partner and a participant in the lab. So the Reframed Lab consists of 6 low-rise multifamily buildings that are owned by BC Housing and Metro Vancouver Housing, and many with them with deferred maintenance and now in need of significant upgrades. So they are affordable, social, and supportive housing with diverse residents, and they're located throughout BC. 6 design teams, each assigned to one building, are participating in this Reframed Lab, which consists of online workshops with presentations and exercises led by subject matter experts. So their designs are aiming to address reduction in energy and greenhouse gas emissions, but they're also looking to improve climate and seismic risk, health and well-being, and to address residents' concerns. So in order to understand the residents' needs and concerns, it makes sense to ask those who live and work in the buildings directly. And knowing that we're working with vulnerable populations, social housing, and individuals with mental health issues, for example, we wanted to make sure that they are being taken care of during construction. So this was a prime motivator for including resident engagement. So successfully working with residents during a retrofit has to start early. So with the help of Miriam Rizei, we created a survey and distributed it to the current buildings. So we asked those who live and work in the buildings what their issues were so that we could expose some areas that need improvement that possibly wouldn't have been considered otherwise. So some of the questions that we asked included temperature control and comfort. Is it too hot, too cold, or too drafty? We asked about noise complaints between suites or outdoor noises. And we asked about their use of green spaces and communal spaces and any other issues they had with their buildings. We also did interviews with the building managers to see which complaints that they were having the most from residents and how the residents use the building. And then we took a bit more in-depth approach with one building, and we had additional interviews, and we hosted a town hall with their residents. So we came up with a few best practices for creating a resident engagement survey, and we worked with RDH to come up with the questions. And the one thing that we really want to emphasize is if you're going to do a survey, make sure that you have very specific questions so that your data is as accurate as possible. So if you are starting off with vague questions before a retrofit, you won't be able to really follow up with that if you fix the issue or not. So a quick example is instead of asking if they feel drafts in their unit, ask them if there are drafts coming near the windows. That way you can specifically say that the windows have either been fixed or not. And another thing was to really focus on the cause rather than the effect of some issues. So for example, you could ask if there was mold in their apartment. They may not see the mold if it's behind the walls, or they may think that dirt is mold. But we know that, for example, window condensation usually leads to mold. So if you ask them if there's condensation on their windows, which is very easy for them to measure, they can see the condensation, you'll know if there is potentially mold, and then you'll know if it's been fixed in the end. So another thing that came up was we did the survey in the summer, and some of the residents filled it out after the heat dome that I mentioned. So this was really key for us to learn about just how bad the buildings were in the summer. So some of the residents, for example, had to leave and go to cooling centers just to make it through that heat dome. We also learned that inefficient systems were making everything worse. So if you already have a hot building and then you have inefficient hot water pipes, that heat's coming off and making an already hot building even hotter. And we learned that without the residents understanding the systems, that it's going to make everything less efficient. So for example, when you're hot and they propped open their door to try and get some airflow coming into their unit, that in turn made the thermostat lower and then signal to the boiler to turn on, again, making it even hotter. So that was really key for learning about how the buildings operated in the summer. However, if you're in 40-degree weather and all you can think about is being hot, you may not remember that in the winter, you were also cold and you may have had other issues. So if you have the opportunity, doing 2 surveys during different seasons is definitely recommended to get a full picture of the issues. Now, like I mentioned, we asked the residents as well as the building managers. So it's important to also ask any staff that work in the buildings if they have any issues because they use the spaces differently. They may see parts of the building that the residents don't see. And so just making sure that you get everyone's point of view. And finally, being open with survey purposes with the residents, especially when you're dealing with mental health issues or affordable housing, for example. They may be paranoid or stressed out about these surveys having something to do with their living conditions and their home. So just making sure that they understand that the only reason that we are doing this is to improve the conditions, and it has nothing to do with them, being kicked out or any state of their living situation. So we're currently in the middle of this process, and we will have some follow-up data at the end to see if it was worth doing a more in-depth approach with the additional interviews in the town hall, or if just an overview with the survey was sufficient. So you can stay tuned for that in the next year or so. So I'm just going to quickly talk a little bit about some of the key survey findings because these issues are so common with older buildings. So we asked them about their comfort of the temperature, both in the summer and in the winter. So on the left here, you can see that over 50%, so the red and the blue, were uncomfortable or very uncomfortable in the summer. And on the right, we have the winter, and we still have about 40% of residents who are uncomfortable with the temperature. Now, this was an issue for all 6 buildings, and a common root cause is there's rarely control of the temperatures in the unit, so they don't normally have control of over their own like air conditioning or heating. And they're older central hydronic heating systems, and it's exacerbated by poor passive cooling design and lack of mechanical air conditioning. So we also asked if they were satisfied with the ability to control the temperature, both in the summer and winter. And again, here you can see with blue and red that almost 2/3 of residents were not satisfied with their ability to control their temperature. So they don't have air conditioning or the ability to turn it on. And in the winter, still 45% of people were not satisfied with their ability to control their temperature. We also asked about air quality, and either by natural or forced ventilation is also an issue in all 6 buildings. So again, keep in mind that we did this in the summer, so it's unlikely that they'd be complaining about the drafts, but we have a few people who said it was a bit too drafty. However, a lot of the residents were complaining that the air was too still, so they just had no airflow in the summer. And then we also asked if they were satisfied with the freshness of air in their unit, and we have about 1/3 of residents who were unsatisfied, and a lot of their complaints were from secondhand smoke coming into their units from their neighbors. So this is also a very important issue. And one of the problems here is that several older buildings don't have washroom or kitchen exhaust fans, and they don't have central air conditioning or filtered supply of outdoor air. And finally, we already know that energy costs contribute greatly to total housing costs, particularly for lower income residents. So we asked them to what extent their electricity bills were a financial burden to them. And we see here that 50% said that they are somewhat or a heavy financial burden. So we already know that the bills are a burden, and now we're going to be going from gas, which is included in their rent and cheaper, to electricity, which could make these bills an even higher burden. So this is something that we need to consider to make sure that retrofits don't make the housing unaffordable for the residents. So in order to address the residents' concerns, we want to take a holistic approach at deep retrofits. And by doing that, we can basically solve all of the issues that I mentioned previously. So by doing a deep retrofit, we will have better temperature control and comfort. So it's less cold in the winter and less hot in the summer, and gives the residents more independence because they'll have control over their temperature. It'll provide better air quality from both smoke and external air, as well as between neighboring suites. It'll make both the buildings and the residents more resilient from climate and seismic risk, so they're less likely to have to be relocated if an extreme event occurs, and they'll be less prone to flooding and power outages. It'll also improve the user interaction. So this is anybody who uses the building, including staff, residents, and visitors. And if we do simple upgrades as well while you're doing a retrofit, like paint colors and more natural light, it'll really make buildings feel less institutional and more like home. And by doing all of these things, we're going to be increasing their health and well-being. And on top of that, we can be thinking about adding green spaces and communal spaces to increase their sense of community. So by addressing all of these concerns, we create happier residents, which is going to reduce turnover, which for them reduces their stress, and for building owners also saves money. So early well-planned resident engagement can ensure projects are on schedule and on budget. And I noticed when Ian mentioned that some costs might come up later on, like for example, if your residents are overheating, if you are already thinking that before you start doing this retrofit, you're going to plan for that money, and then you're going to be on budget. You don't have to worry about those costs coming up later. So that was a really good example for this. Now, we asked our Reframed design teams some of their plans to minimize the resident disruption. So they are in the design phase currently, but they have done retrofits in the past and they will be doing these next year. But they were all told that they need to minimize the disruption to residents, and it's very rare that they'll be able to displace multiple residents at a time. So some of their plans included focusing on envelope upgrades. So that's including insulation and windows and doors. They've also mentioned using those engineered prefabricated panels that I mentioned before from Energy Sprong. So these panels are made off-site and then they're delivered onto the construction site and can be installed in as little as 1 day, which reduces the amount of time that construction needs to be done on site. And this does increase upfront costs, but it reduces the labor and disruption costs down the road. They also mentioned planning efficient sequencing and keeping the internal upgrades to a minimum. So avoiding going inside the suites unless they absolutely have to. And for one example, they have to remove gas fireplaces, which is disruptive. They will be in the suites to do that, but they have told the residents that by removing the heating and the gas fireplace that they'll be getting air conditioning, which to them is worth it here in BC, and it could also be in a hot Ontario summer as well. Now, they also all mentioned involving residents in the process. So this could be as little as just keeping them updated on the process of the retrofit, but it could also be in terms of input on some of the design features, and it could be as much as including them in some of the jobs. So if there's some construction like painting that they could be doing. And one building even mentioned putting in a coffee shop in the lobby, and this would allow them to have a bit more of a community, but also gave people with mental health issues an opportunity to work, make a little bit of money and gain some valuable skills. And then finally, they all mentioned communicating all of these benefits that I've mentioned to the residents so they understand why they're going through this process. Now, these methods to minimize disruption are important, but the reality is the tenants and the residents will be disrupted. So in order to have a smooth experience for everyone, you're going to consider appointing a tenant or a resident liaison. So this liaison works directly with the residents throughout the design and construction, and they're going to understand the resident needs and use of their spaces. They're going to highlight and demonstrate the retrofit benefits to them, and they're going to accommodate residents with sensitivities and special needs. They're also going to keep the residents informed about the process, activities, and timelines, and minimize disruption and impacts on resident schedules. So they're there to facilitate the communication between residents and the construction crew. So this person is part of the construction team, so they will attend all of the project-related meetings, and they'll be there to ensure that the residents' impacts are considered throughout the process. They may also host a welcoming town hall meeting, so all the residents can come and learn about the process that's about to be happening. And this is also a really great time to use those engagement surveys and to interview some of the residents if you're going to do that. This person's also going to set realistic expectations about resident impacts during construction and provide ongoing support. Now, they're going to document the resident concerns in order to make sure that they have been resolved by this retrofit. So this person should be somebody who can humanize the project and be compassionate. For example, we had somebody who was very paranoid and stressed out about people being in their suite, and the liaison took them out for coffee for 4 hours in order to just kind of give them peace of mind while the people were doing the work. So someone like that can really make this process a lot smoother. Now, we have a case study online called Retrofitting with Tenants in Place, which talks more about this process with a tenant liaison. So you're welcome to check that out on our Pembina website. And we have, I just clicked the website. We have more resources online. So we have our Reframed tech series with deep retrofit solution backgrounders. We have our innovation library and retrofit supply chain map. And we also have more research and case studies on the Pembina website that you may be interested in. And we, along with TAF, are happy to see that the federal budget has a $200 million budget set aside for Retrofit Accelerator Fund, which is key for this process to go a lot smoother. So our websites are reframedinitiative.org and pembina.org. Thank you so much. I see that there's a few questions popping up, so if we have time for those, I'm happy to dive in.
Great, thank you, Emma. So the first question is from someone asking if the audience could get a copy of your survey questions for the tenants. Is that available on the website?
I will have to check. I'm not sure where we are in the process of sharing the information yet, but if you do send me or Efficiency Capital an email, I can follow up with them.
Perfect. All right, we will do that. The next question is, are you measuring the difference between the pre and post retrofit indoor environmental quality?
Yes, so they did a pre-measurement of the indoor air quality, and then once they put in the new systems, they will be doing a follow-up measurement.
Right. And I understand this project is still in